Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to get things started right away because we are having a live feed so that family members can watch this as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our State Attorney of the Ninth Judicial Circuit, Ms. Aramis Ayala.
Thank you, Erica. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. As State Attorney, my oversight and duties, as well as my responsibilities, reach beyond the day-to-day litigation and prosecution of criminal activity. I also conduct and oversee what are called shoot reviews. A shoot review is the process of an independent review of facts, evidence, and circumstances in cases that involve a law enforcement officer discharging his or her firearm. Each time an officer pulls the trigger of a firearm here in the Ninth Judicial Circuit and the investigative agency submits the report to my office, a shoot review is then undertaken. In a standard review, when a law enforcement officer discharges a firearm, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement will conduct their own investigation into the details of the shooting. That investigative report is sent to me for review, triggering a shoot review. If the discharge of the firearm was reasonable under the circumstances and under Florida criminal law, then the officer is cleared of any wrongdoing. If, on the other hand, the discharge of the firearm is not reasonable under Florida criminal law, then I assess the case's fitness for criminal prosecution and file the appropriate criminal charges. The purpose of this press conference is to present my findings regarding the shoot review of shots fired by law enforcement officers at the Pulse nightclub on June 12, 2016. While this process is standard in my office, this does stem from a tragedy that ended the lives of 49 people, wounded dozens more, and impacted our entire community due to the senseless act of a domestic terrorist. It is important to note that the scope of my office's involvement in the investigation is limited to two things. Number one, a review of shots fired by law enforcement that night, and number two, a determination of whether or not those shots were justified. All other details are outside the scope of my responsibilities as the state attorney. While a standard shoot review generally is based upon FDLE's investigation, here an investigation was also submitted to my office by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was submitted in May of 2018. Since that time, I, along with my Chief Assistant State Attorney, Deborah Barra, and my Chief Investigator, Eric Edwards, remain focused and determined to find answers. Ms. Barra was relentless, and I gave her the task of heading up that shoot review. By remaining in constant contact with me with updates and briefings, I developed full confidence in her work product. In just a few moments, I'm going to ask her to come forward and provide you with the details of that shoot review. But before that, I want to say to the survivors, and to all of you who have lost a loved one, we are still standing with you. And in this moment of solace and remembrance, I want you to know that you're not alone. I understand that so many of you who were injured are still healing, both physically and mentally. But I also want you to know that in this fight for public safety, you will never be forgotten. While there's no way to take away the pain and the devastation that has been imparted upon our community, it is my hope that sharing the results of this investigation will help survivors and the loved ones to find closure and answer any questions that they may have. They do deserve to have answers. Ms. Barra?
Hi, and thank you for being here. As the state attorney said, my job was essentially to look to see how many people, as far as members of law enforcement, fired their weapons, why they fired their weapons, and essentially where did those bullets go. And in order to find the answers to those questions, we could answer the ultimate question of, in the single moment where they decided to pull the trigger, were they justified in doing so? So in order to get that information, we reviewed the evidence that was available from the scene, from the witnesses, the video footage, ballistic reports, and specifically what we reviewed starting on May 17th of 2018 was a compilation of evidence that was provided to us. It included over 350 witness statements. It included police radio traffic, helicopter footage, dashboard footage, body camera footage, video footage from inside the club, ballistic reports, and 911 calls. And by taking all of that information, we established the facts of what happened on June 12th in 2016. We know that at that date, over 400 shots were fired. Those 400 shots, over 400 shots, were fired by 15 people. 14 of those individuals were law enforcement. There was obviously one person who was not a member of law enforcement. That person is the individual who murdered 49 people. That person is the person who attempted to murder hundreds of people. And that is the person who emotionally traumatized thousands of people in our community. I will be referring to that person as simply the shooter. I will not ever say his name. It is very clear to me that during this event, he wanted notoriety. He wanted people to know his name. And therefore, I will never play a part in that. And I ask you, members of the press, to also not play a part in that. I am going to start with the actions of the shooter, the facts that we developed in terms of what he did that night. And then I'm going to address the actions of law enforcement members who were there that night. So, these are the facts regarding the conduct of the shooter. Let me see if this is this on? That's okay.
Test, test, test.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So pertaining to the actions of the shooter, at 2:01 a.m., the shooter entered Pulse nightclub. He was armed with 2 firearms. One was an assault rifle, and one was a 9mm handgun. We know that as soon as he entered the club, he made a right-hand turn, and he walked through the main areas where the dancing was taking place of the club. When he was walking through, he was firing both weapons. He fired approximately and a minimum of 186 times from his assault rifle. He also fired a minimum of 22 times from his 9mm handgun. We know that as he walked the main areas of the dance floor, that he looped around and he came back towards this area of the club. And something significant happened at that point. What happened was that his assault rifle jammed. We know that his assault rifle jammed because there was a spent shell casing that was jammed in the weapon, and it required law enforcement to use a dowel in order to unjam it after they recovered his firearm. And that's significant because I believe that actually saved lives. He then continued on to the club into this area here, which is a small corridor where the only areas you can go is to the north or the south bathroom. He then entered the south bathroom and he fired his 9mm handgun. He then went to the north bathroom and continued to fire his handgun. He then went back to the south bathroom and he took his handgun and he fired over the bathroom stalls and under the bathroom stalls, shooting the people who were trying to get safety there. He then went back to the north bathroom and he remained there for approximately 3 hours. During this period of 3 hours, he did not fire an additional round. What he did do is he called 911 5 times. He mentioned during the calls that he had explosives in the parking lot. He also was on his phone, and he was Googling how to spell the word allegiance. And he also tried to research how to unjam his firearm. Again, we know that he was not successful in figuring that out. Approximately 3 hours later, around 5:13 in the morning, he fires his handgun again. The evidence supports that what he did is he went, and he was still in the north bathroom. He opened a stall door, and he fired approximately 3 to 5 rounds. Now, the evidence supports that when he fired those rounds, he fired into people who were unfortunately already deceased. At that point, he then came out of the north bathroom, and there was a hole that was created by law enforcement that I'll talk about in a little bit. And he again took his 9mm firearm and fired a minimum of 2 shots. One shot hit an officer in the helmet, and another shot hit a survivor who had just been rescued from the south bathroom and was running this way, and it struck him in the back of his right calf. At that point, law enforcement returned fire, and he was eventually killed and pronounced dead at the scene. Those are the facts pertaining to the shooter. I'm now going to go through the facts determined for each law enforcement officer who fired their weapon. On this chart, you'll see some numbers 1 through 5, and those are the order in which the law enforcement engagements took place. We know that there were 5 separate engagements with law enforcement. And when I say engagements, I mean 5 separate occasions where law enforcement fired their firearms. We know that it was 5 based on the evidence. Listening to the interviews of the people who were there in the club and reviewing those interviews, we were specifically looking for any person who ever mentioned at any time that they believed law enforcement fired on them. We also listened to every single 911 call. And we did this because we wanted to make sure that in the background, we would be able to hear if there were shots being fired. And that was significant because we were able to develop a timeline in terms of when we believed the shots were being fired and when we believed that there shouldn't be any shots being fired. And as a result of that, of putting it together, we know that it is true that there were 5 separate engagements. I'm going to speak to you specifically about each engagement in the order in which they happened. So, the first engagement begins with an officer who was in the parking lot of the Pulse nightclub when the shots started happening. He's on scene and he hears what he believes to be gunshots. He hears that and he is moving with the gunshots because he can hear it from the outside of what's happening inside. He calls out on the radio that shots are fired, and he sees people exiting the nightclub, some of them severely injured, some of them deceased. He then moves to his position to position number 1. And position number 1 is right in front of, these were double doors that were there, double exit doors. And what happens is when the people are exiting the nightclub, the doors open up, and he is able to see 2 people run out, and unfortunately those people were executed by the shooter who is standing inside here. He's able to partially see the shooter. He didn't have a very clear shot, but he could see the gun, he could see some body parts. And so he takes aim from his position at number 1, and he fires approximately 4 times. Now, we know from the positioning that he was standing in and the level of these shots, and by comparing the video from what was happening inside and timing it, we believe that the majority of his shots hit the double doors. We also know that if the shots did not hit the double doors and they continued on, by reviewing the video evidence from inside, we know that nobody else was standing. Therefore, nobody else would have been in the path of his bullets. So I'm very confident to say that the evidence supports that absolutely no civilians were struck during this engagement. That's engagement number 1, 4 shots. Engagement number 2, that same officer is from this perspective, and he can look in and he can see that the shooter is moving east, and he's moving towards the patio area. So hearing and following the gunshots from the outside, the officer rotates around up to position number 2. When he gets to position number 2, it's a patio that's out there, and the patio gates open up. And he's able to see from the patio gates inside the club. And he's able to see the shooter who is still shooting at people inside. At that time, from his position at Orange Avenue, he shoots 3 times into the club at the shooter. Now, the evidence supports that, again, when he fired those rounds, that the shooter was the only person who was standing up at that time. We also were able to time it because when the shots were fired, there was actually a tablecloth that was located in here that we could actually see the projectiles moving the tablecloth as they went. And so we know somewhat of the trajectory of his shots. And viewing who was here, there was no civilians who would have been in that line of fire. So I can say confidently that there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that he struck any civilians at that time. And that completes engagement number 2. Again, the same officer, and he fired a total of 7 shots. Moving on to engagement number 3. Approximately 3 to 4 minutes later, there's a team of officers who are gathered, and they are gathered right out here. And they're listening, and as they get to right about here, they can hear shots being fired. The shots that they hear being fired are the shooter, based on the evidence, shooting his final shots in the south bathroom. They were 9mm shots that were being fired. And so when they're hearing this, they break the glass here, and they enter into this area. Now, they don't know at this time how many shooters there are. They're not sure what the description is. And so they have to clear the area that they're in. And when they're looking around here, making sure that it's safe, the shooting stops. They then move into this area because they know that the shots came from this side of the club. And they go and set up behind this bar, which is shoot number 3. Now, at this point in time, they know that the shots have come from here. And so they are focused on the 2 doors in the north and the south bathroom. And they're anticipating that the shooter is going to reemerge. And what happens is the door to the south bathroom opens up. And there's an individual who is described as kind of crouching low and peeking around the corner. The officers who are behind the bar give him verbal commands. show me your hands, show me your hands, and the individual doesn't comply. And so 2 officers from the position of number 3 fire their rifles in the direction of the south bathroom door at that person. 1 officer fired 1 time, and we know that that officer struck the mirror that was located right here. The other officer fired 3 times. Based on the evidence, we believe that his projectiles either hit a portion of the door because it was still slightly ajar, or hit the back wall. But we know for a fact that they did not hit the individual. And we know that because minutes later, that same individual, who's a civilian, comes out of the south bathroom. He complies with what they're saying, and the police are able to escort him safely out of the club. That is engagement number 3. Now, as I stated before, there was a period of approximately 3 hours where no shots were fired, and we're up to that point right now. So what's happening during this 3-hour period from a law enforcement standpoint is they are trying to rescue the civilians who are in both the north and the south bathrooms. And so what they're doing is they're punching holes in the concrete along this wall. The first hole that they punched, they were anticipating that it would be in the south bathroom because they knew at this point that the shooter was in the north bathroom and that there were people who were still in the south bathroom. So they attempted to put a hole in the south bathroom to get them out, but what they ended up doing is just being a little off, and they put a hole right at the end of the hallway. They realized that it was the hallway, so then they moved further down and started punching additional holes to get out the survivors. As they are just about finished with rescuing the people in the south bathroom, that is when they hear shots fired in the north bathroom. Upon hearing the shots fired, in less than 30 seconds, they throw what's called flash bombs. They're a distractionary device that looks like there's an explosion, or it is kind of an explosion, to basically draw out the shooter in the north bathroom. And it worked. The shooter then appeared in this area right here, the hole in the concrete. The shooter appeared and he was firing his 9mm handgun. Now, with the flashbangs, there's a lot of smoke that gets created, and so the officers were firing towards that muzzle flash. And at that point, 13 members of law enforcement fired their firearms. There were 10 officers from the Orlando Police Department and 3 deputy sheriffs. And combined, the 13 individuals fired a minimum of 172 times. When they fired towards that hole, they hit the shooter 7 times. The shooter fell backwards. Now, we know, based on the evidence, that they only hit the shooter. They did not hit any civilians at that time. And here's how we know that. The people who were remaining at this time inside the club that could be rescued, there were the people in the south bathroom, and when this shooting occurred, they were rescued. The individual who ended up getting shot in the calf, he was either the last person out of the bathroom or the second last person out of the bathroom. And so we know that those people were safe. So what we're really focused on are the survivors in the north bathroom, because we were looking to see, was there any way that out of those minimum, again, of 172 bullets, could they have possibly hit one of those individuals? And we know the answer to be that it did not. And we know that because one unique about the north bathroom is you can see here, the door is here. And so if you were to enter into the north bathroom, you face a wall and you have to turn right and then go left to get to where the stalls are. And the survivors were in the stalls. So from this angle, if you were to shoot, and let's just say a projectile went there, the wall was separating the survivors from the trajectory of the bullets. That wall we reviewed, and there were no markings from projectiles. This wall was clear. So it indicates to us that none of these bullets were able to reach the people who were there. In addition to that, we have the eyewitness statements of the individuals who were in the north bathroom and survived. And at no point does anybody ever say that anyone else was hit at that time. So based on the evidence, we believe that no civilians were hit in shoot number 4. And that brings us to shoot number 5, the final shoot that was done. What happens here is that as a result of shoot number 4, he goes down. Officer approaches him, and it appeared that on his person or close to his person was a device, potentially an explosive device, that it looked like there were wires that were extending out. And in addition to that, the manner in which the shooter was laid out, his handgun was about 1.5 inches, 2 inches away from his hand. So to ensure that he was no longer a threat, one bullet was fired into the shooter, and he was no longer a threat. Those are the 5 engagements by law enforcement. Each and every engagement, no civilians were struck, and each time the law enforcement officer pulled the trigger, it was reasonable and justifiable. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. I've issued formal clearance letters for all of the officers who were involved, but I want to be clear today. After a review of shots fired by law enforcement officers on June 12, 2016 at the Pulse nightclub, all officers have been cleared of any wrongdoing. No casualties were the result of friendly fire, and my review has now been complete. While our review is narrow and the scope of it is extremely tight with regard to the things that we are engaging in and reviewing to close out this investigation, even with that narrow view, I'm going to allow Ms. Barrett to step forward and answer any specific questions you may have regarding the investigation.
Yes, sir.
CBS News.
Yes, sir.
This is as extensive an investigation as I've ever covered. I'm just wondering if you have an estimate or guesstimate as to how many man hours and how many people worked on this investigation over the last couple of years.
Sure. So we actually, the FBI did an incredible job of collecting and preserving the evidence. On May 16th, I believe, it was either May 16th or May 17th, they issued their final ballistics report. And at that time, we began looking at all of the evidence. It was myself and Chief Investigator Eric Edwards who did an incredible job on it. Yes, ma'am.
How How much of a relief was it for you to go through this investigation and see that none of these victims were killed by friendly fire?
Again, we are a neutral party. We're looking at the facts in terms of what happened that night. And it's really important to kind of take that out of it because you never want to be biased going into an investigation. And we made it a point of not researching anything, not looking at anything. There was a trial of his wife that I did not follow in any way because I didn't want anything to even unintentionally cross my mind as to what the facts were that took place. And so we were really just focused on the evidence at the scene. Yes, ma'am.
After the FBI provided you the report in May, what else did you have to do to investigate and make sure that their facts were the way that they were?
We had to review it all. I would say that, the witness statements, we made sure that we had every witness statement of anybody who was present. That obviously takes a lot of time. And it was also important to review all of the 911 calls as well, and that took a lot of time as well. And then going through the ballistics and pairing up, we wanted to try to get as a specific count, an accurate count of exactly what took place and who fired what and when exactly as we could. So it was pretty extensive in delving into that.
So was this today the first time that victims and their families heard this information, or have you been in touch with them since May of last year to let them know, hey, initial report from the FBI says this information?
No, so prior to coming here, it was very important to us that we met with victims and gave them a preview of what we were going to say. And in fact, they are listening right now. And I want to say to the victims that I met with earlier this morning, I appreciate everything that you guys were doing, and I appreciate your attention this morning. And to those victims or loved ones of people who were victims at Pulse, if at any time you have questions about what took place, please reach out to our office. We are happy to answer whatever questions we can. Yes, sir.
I know you were focused on the movements of the gunmen and the law enforcement officers.
Yes, sir.
But was there any noteworthy movement of the patrons while they were inside when this was going down that was of interest?
Nothing that stands out, and it's probably because, again, our focus was a little bit different. I mean, there was a lot going on there, but no, there wasn't anything that stands out in my mind. Yes, ma'am. The autopsy reports were absolutely a part of the review, and there were no projectiles recovered from any of the victims that were traced back to any law enforcement firearms. Yes. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. So you're talking about the people who were injured. Yes, there's absolutely no evidence that anybody who was injured was shot by law enforcement. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes. The shooter was down, and he was hit in the head. Yes. Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll let her answer it. It is the end of the line. That's why I closed it out. At this point, if there were something that were criminal, we would proceed. There is absolutely nothing criminal on the conduct of anyone, so there is no criminal prosecution that will proceed. It is the end for us. No. It was part of law enforcement's original review that then is submitted to us to make our findings, our review of it. I've already talked to the sheriff. I've talked to all the agency heads, sent messages to them regarding the clearance of their officers before we met here today.
Yes, ma'am.
In other situations like this across the country when we see mass shootings, there's often reviews done like this and then best practices or suggestions moving forward. Is there any takeaways
I'm always open to have conversations with anyone. However, that's really not my expertise. Really the focus of this was to review what law enforcement gave us and to determine the facts based on the evidence. So, yes, ma'am.
How often are these shoot reports done on every case that handles for office? Is it for every single case, or is it for specific ones like this one?
Sure. So anytime that a law enforcement officer fires their weapon in Orange or Osceola County, we do a shoot review. And so we do the same practice in terms of following the bullets. Now, obviously, this one was a lot more extensive than typical, and I hate to use that word. There's really no such thing, I think, as a typical shooting. But yes, this was a lot more involved.
I'm just clarifying a couple of things so that it's clear. An investigation has to be submitted to us by an investigative body. So if there's a shooting that occurs in this community, our review doesn't get triggered until something is submitted to us that allows us to get that information and to review it. So other than that, we will.
Yes, ma'am. That's okay.
During the 3-hour period where no shots were fired,
Sure.
in the review, did it say whether anyone unfortunately bled out during that time? And also, how many people were able to be removed from the club at that time and safely?
Because of, so to answer your first question, I do not know the answer to that. No, that wasn't, and yeah, that was what I did. And your second question in terms of during that time, how many other people were rescued, that wasn't the focus of my investigation either. And so I know that rescues were happening, but I didn't, because I knew that law enforcement wasn't, I knew that at that time that wasn't engagements with law enforcement. Now, I reviewed all of those witness statements to make sure that, for example, if they were clearing out the people who hid upstairs, you know, when they were doing that, to make sure that when somebody kind of popped out or opened a door, that nobody fired upon them. And so we were very clear and confident that it was these 5 engagements, and then that's what we focused on.
Was that information in the FBI report, though, and just not part of the scope of the shoot review?
I don't know. I really can't speak to that, because what we were looking at was the evidence itself. Yes, ma'am. Again, that wasn't really my focus of what we were reviewing, and so I really can't speak to that. Yes, ma'am. That's a really good question. I never answered that. So what appears to have happened is during the commotion, it appears that an exit sign that was at the club actually fell on or about his person, and I believe it was actually touching him. And so when the officer walked up, and knowing that he had previously talked about bombs being present, and he saw wires and whatnot, you know, it only takes that, you know, for something terrible to happen. And so the officer made sure that that did not happen. Yes, ma'am. I really can't. And it doesn't, honestly, and I appreciate the question, I really do, but we were going to work until we figured out the answers, and it really wasn't anything that we were paying attention to as to how much time.
Was this somebody's full-time job for weeks on end?
No, we were doing that along with our regular responsibilities. Yes, sir.
Notice you got that presentation, no notes, you clearly know this backward and forward. I can't imagine the emotional toll in having reviewed all this, but having gone through that, what do you hope the community takes away from everything you've your teams?
Well, I hate to speak on that, because yes, for me, it was emotional. I think as a human being, it's emotional, but I have absolutely no nothing in terms of emotions compared to the people who are actually there and what they're going through. And I think, you know, if in a very small way that this provides some answers to questions, then that's great. And I want people to understand that we're completely transparent with this, that, again, we're a neutral party who is trying to get to the facts. And if it brings even this much comfort to them to just kind of know what happened, then I think that would be a success. Yes, sir. We did not reach out to any other agencies. We did it completely. It was Eric Edwards and myself who were doing the review. And again, I'm open and willing to speaking with anybody who has any questions. Yes, ma'am.
When you said you interviewed 350 witnesses, obviously some of those were survivors of the club, and I would assume some still living with PTSD. Can you talk about what that process was like, and did you have to provide services to help them through sort of reliving this?
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. Let me clarify. I reviewed interviews. So I didn't personally go out and conduct all of those interviews. There are a few people that I absolutely needed to speak to, and so I did, but it was a lot of reviewing in its entirety in terms of all the information that we had. And I do know that, yeah, I mean, obviously everybody is affected who is there, and I can't fathom what they're going through. Well, it's sad. You know, again, I would never even try to understand what the perspective or what's the mindset of somebody who's been through this. And again, I honestly don't know if this provides anything to them. No matter what, they're not going to get their loved one back, and that is forever. And I'm so sorry to all of them that have to go through this. So I think it is all very sad. And we are also going to do a follow-up with the victims, and we're going to be available and answer whatever questions they may have. I can't. I mean, I can just tell you that the case is closed. But, you know, I also think that whether you are a civilian or whether you're a member of law enforcement, this was impactful. And I think that, you know, if I had to guess, I would say that members of law enforcement were just as impacted by seeing that and going through that, unfortunately. And so I just wish everybody the best. Thank you all very much.
I wish you'd just go up there. Oh, that's okay. We're going to try to Chief Mina.
I just had to get my face.
Can we have him up at the?
Okay, well, maybe we can just have him down here. How about like right here?
Yep. We'll give everybody like a minute to set up, okay? So that whoever wants them will be able to come over. No, we're giving folks a minute to set up, so.
I'm afraid your cord's going to...
Is everybody ready, or you need a little bit more time? Everybody ready? Good?
Want to squeeze in? No. Thank you. Can you see?
Okay, so happy to take any questions.
How are you feeling now knowing that none of your officers were involved in this, in killing or injuring any of these victims or survivors?
Well, first, anytime we talk about Pulse, I like to, my heart goes out to the victims and their families. Something that I think about, something that our officers and deputies think about all the time. I was very, very impressed with the state attorney's review, and we were called there yesterday and got that same review. So, although the investigation took a long time, I was impressed by the detail, and obviously many, if not all, the details that you heard today, I had already been privy to through reviews of evidence and and different things throughout these past 2.5 years. So I know that the officers and deputies are relieved by this, but I also know that they knew in their own minds they were justified. But I think again, to have now another independent party come out with a review of their actions, which were courageous and brave, and they did what they had to do and saved many, many lives that night.
Sheriff, can you talk about the nearness
Had
with...
you seen the FBI report prior to the meeting with the state attorney yesterday?
Yeah, I'd seen the report, like it's that they have. I'd spoken to the FBI on many occasions, and like I said, knew many of the details, and that one important detail I think a lot of people in our community, and survivors and families and victims, were asking or wanting was that there was absolutely no evidence that our officers and deputies bullets struck any of the victims.
Do you think that those victims should have been notified before today of the information that came out? Back in May?
That's not my, like I said, it wasn't our investigation. The only thing that, I can speak to, was the response.
Can you talk about that near-miss incident? Is there any lesson you take away from that? The near friendly fire?
What now?
The near friendly fire incident when 2 officers almost shot?
I'm very familiar with that specific incident. And again, those officers faced one of the most difficult and complex, hostage, active shooter, domestic terrorism type incident in the history of the United States, as far as I'm concerned, and their actions are justified, and they and I were very glad to hear, although we knew that none of their bullets hit any victims, but we're relieved that now the final report is known, and then everyone has the same information that we have.
Will you be making any adjustments to shooter engagement policy based off of the report, or?
And so, the Justice Department already did an independent review, and you have already seen that. The review was conducted by the Police Foundation. And I think one of the things that's important to note that in that review, it did talk about those 3 hours, and during those 3 hours, over 90 survivors were rescued by law enforcement. So we're constantly changing, policies, procedures, specific tactics, to give you, an indication of that. Now most agencies are going to a single deputy or single officer response in light of the Parkland tragedy, and so we're always constantly, updating our training, our tactics to keep up with the bad guys.
So you're changing it based off of the report, or just in general, or?
No, like I said, we're always adjusting training based on incidents that happen and best practices that are done
We'll take 2 more
around the country.
questions.
When you were chief, there was some criticism from the public of that 3 hours that you mentioned, and also, the shots being fired. Do you feel like there's a weight off of your back now that people know for sure that the officers didn't shoot anybody inside that club other than the killer?
That comes with the position. I'm relieved for the officers and deputies, the brave men and women who actually went inside there at risk to their own lives, and now themselves have a little bit of final closure and relief that they weren't responsible for the death of a victim.
Are you going to be providing any type of PTSD services for officers?
So yesterday, I put out a department-wide message to the entire Orange County Sheriff's Office. I know the Orlando Police Department did the same, reminding them of how these incidents and how the updates and reviews of these incidents sometimes bring back those feelings. So we've offered, again, all of our services available in the form of our mostly employee assistance program and